The shutdown, now in its 40th day, did not begin as a fight over a single healthcare subsidy extension. It began as the first meaningful confrontation over whether the executive branch must still follow statutory law at all. That point is pretty easy to lose in the daily reporting cycle, where every congressional dispute becomes a matter of who blinked, whose polling numbers dipped, and which party is messaging better. But the conflict underlying this shutdown is not ideological. It is constitutional, whether a president may unilaterally abolish congressionally mandated agencies, suspend programs, or withhold appropriated funds, and whether Congress will enforce its own authority when confronted with that refusal. The conflict began long before the shutdown vote. Over the past year, the administration repeatedly moved to scale back, delay, or suspend portions of federal programs that Congress had already authorized and funded. In some cases, these actions were described as routine reviews, efficiency cleanups, or ideological course corrections, but the effects were concrete. Required funds were not released, obligated grants were halted midstream, and statutory programs were allowed to wither without congressional approval. These were not temporary shutdown artifacts. They predated the shutdown and continued alongside it. The pattern was clearest in cases where independent watchdogs or courts intervened. The Government Accountability Office found that the National Institutes of Health unlawfully withheld grant funding in violation of the Impoundment Control Act, a statute designed precisely to prevent presidents from ignoring congressionally mandated spending. Under the Impoundment Control Act of 1974, the executive branch may not withhold or delay congressionally appropriated funds unless Congress itself authorizes the change. The president does not have discretion to decline implementation simply because the administration disagrees with a program. The Department of Health and Human Services withheld more than $825 million from the Head Start program, prompting another GAO finding that the administration had no legal discretion to do so. A federal judge similarly ordered the release of $11.5 billion in foreign aid that the executive branch had refused to distribute despite explicit congressional appropriation. Even infrastructure funds were not spared. The administration froze billions for the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program, again triggering a GAO ruling that the executive had violated appropriations law. Taken together, these cases point to something larger than bureaucratic mismanagement. They reveal an emerging claim of power, the assertion that the executive may choose which laws to execute and which to ignore, not based on statutory authority, but on political preference. This is not a policy disagreement. It is a constitutional one. Congress writes the laws. The executive is required to faithfully execute them. If the executive can decline to implement duly enacted programs without consequence, the legislative power of the purse becomes mostly symbolic, and the balance of constitutional power tilts decisively toward the presidency. The shutdown is now so disruptive that, honestly, many Americans have stopped trying to follow what it's about. Flights are being delayed, federal workers are unpaid, basic administrative functions have slowed to a crawl, and citizens are going hungry from the administration's decision to withhold SNAP benefits. It is tempting to treat this simply as another ugly budget fight, but it is not. What is at stake is whether Congress still exercises binding authority over the executive branch, or whether law is now optional. Yet when Senate Democrats publicly explained their reasons for refusing to pass a funding bill, they did not name this constitutional crisis. Instead, they framed it around a single, specific issue: healthcare subsidies. The choice was politically familiar, emotionally resonant, and easily understood. But it also narrowed the terms of negotiation to a policy concession that could be traded away without addressing the actual source of the conflict: the weakening of Congress's ability to compel the executive branch to follow the law. This framing error created the conditions for failure. Democrats rallied supporters around the moral urgency of the shutdown. They described it as necessary to protect vulnerable Americans. But Democrats did not demand the one thing that would have resolved the crisis: a binding enforcement mechanism ensuring the executive branch follows existing law. Now that the shutdown's human and administrative costs have mounted, A faction of Democrats is preparing to pull the rug out without obtaining any binding oversight mechanism. They would reopen the government, declare an empty victory over themselves, and leave Congress no stronger than when the shutdown began. If that happens, the damage will not be limited to this year's budget cycle. It will establish a precedent. The executive may decline to implement laws it opposes, and Congress will respond with speeches, not enforcement. But the shutdown is not over, and the Senate still has one exit that does not end in capitulation. The only meaningful resolution is to tie reopening the government to a verifiable, enforceable oversight mechanism. That does not mean symbolic review. It means something with teeth. A statutory requirement that agency reductions and program suspensions receive congressional certification before execution. A binding reporting schedule, with penalties for non-compliance. Inspector General authority expanded beyond advisory review and into operational pause triggers. Any of these would restore Congress's constitutional role without requiring the administration to reverse its policy goals. They would not dictate outcomes, only ensure that outcomes occur through lawful process. So, this is the real choice. Either end the shutdown with a deal the White House can break the next morning, or use the shutdown as leverage to restore the basic principle that the president does not get to choose which laws count. We do have to understand that the longer the shutdown continues, the more political pressure mounts, not on the administration, but actually on the Senate Democratic caucus. That is the nature of shutdowns. The public feels the pain first. The constitutional problem is harder to see. But abandoning the shutdown without securing oversight would not restore normal operations. It would, in effect, ratify the very behavior that triggered the crisis in the first place. Chuck Schumer set the Democrats up with a framing that could be pulled out the moment public pain outpaced political will. That is the essence of a rug pull, the appearance of firm footing, followed by the sudden revelation that the support beneath you was never structural at all. But we are not trapped. The rug has not been fully pulled, not yet. The shutdown's procedural clock is still running, amendments are still open, and the Senate has not cast the final votes that would lock in a deal the administration could ignore the next morning. The senators could still change their minds. Demanding an oversight mechanism with legal teeth can restore the balance of power that Congress has been losing case by case, agency by agency, appropriation by appropriation. Refuse to reopen without it. If they do, the shutdown ends with Congress still being a governing branch. If they don't, the shutdown ends, and something far more important does too: democracy.